Welcome to this press conference with a fact-finding mission on Venezuela on the occasion of the launch of their second report, which is now available online. The embargo on the report has therefore been lifted. The report comes in two parts. It's a shorter 20-page report and a 200-page document containing the detailed findings of the mission. Additionally, we have shared with you a press release in English and Spanish and a fact sheet to help steer you through the key sections in the report. So we are joined today by all three members of the fact-finding mission. Chairperson Marta Valiñas and member Francisco Cox-Vial will make introductory remarks, giving an overview of the report's findings, followed by questions and answers with you. The mission's newest member, Patricia Tapata, who was appointed earlier this month, will be observing today's press conference. She was not involved in the preparation of the report and therefore will not take questions. All of their bios are available on the mission's website. And if I may simply recall that the fact-finding mission has a mandate to investigate gross violations of human rights, including extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment, including those involving sexual and gender-based violence committed since 2014, and to help combat impunity and ensure accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims. The mission is also mandated to report back to the Human Rights Council, which originally established the fact-finding mission back in September 2019 and extended its mandate the following year for an additional 2 years up until September 2022. The fact-finding mission will present today's report to the Human Rights Council next week on Friday, 24 September. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Senora Valiñas for her opening remarks, to be followed by Senor Cox-Vial. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Rolando. And a warm welcome to all the journalists who are attending this press conference and everyone who is watching us online. From October 2020 to August 2021, the first year of its second mandate, the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has focused on investigating and analyzing more in depth the responses of the Venezuelan justice system to the violations of human rights and crimes committed in Venezuela since 2014. Our analysis is focused more specifically on the responses of the justice system to the violations and crimes committed against men and women who are opponents or critics of the government, or perceived by the government as such. These include increasingly individuals and or organizations that document, denounce, or attempt to address human rights or social and economic problems in the country, or individuals that interfere or are perceived to interfere with interests of government actors, whether political, economic, or criminal. Some of these violations were documented during the mission's first mandate and included in its first report, while others were documented over the past year. These violations include arbitrary detention, torture, including sexual violence, short-term enforced disappearance, and arbitrary deprivation of life. The mission conducted a detailed analysis of 183 cases where perceived or real opponents were detained. The mission also held 177 interviews, including with victims or family members, legal representatives, as well as with former judges and prosecutors who have worked in the Venezuelan justice system during the period of the mission's mandate. In addition, the mission gathered information from verified justice sector actors through 86 responses to a public questionnaire, and it conducted an extensive document review of thousands of pages of legal case files and other official documents. While the mission regrets that Venezuelan authorities refuse to respond to the mission's numerous requests for information or to grant it access for in-country investigations, the mission is fortunate to have access to information from within Venezuela, including the various sources mentioned, many of which are present in Venezuela and or worked in the Venezuelan justice system, as well as to the files of cases which originate from the Venezuelan justice system. Based on the investigations and analysis conducted, the mission has reasonable grounds to believe that instead of providing protection to victims of human rights violations and crimes, the Venezuelan justice system has played a significant role in the state's repression of government opponents. It has done so in three main ways, which we will elaborate further. Firstly, through the erosion of its independence. Secondly, by not advancing adequately or sufficiently the prosecution and sanctioning of those responsible for violations committed by other state actors, namely the security and intelligence actors and high-level public officials identified in the mission's first report. And thirdly, by committing or not acting upon procedural irregularities or other human rights violations which marred the cases analyzed by the mission. Our investigations reveal a justice system fraught with undue pressures, both from external political actors and from within the judicial and prosecutorial hierarchies, which compromise the independence of judges and prosecutors. For example, in 102 of the 183 cases examined, the mission recorded that high-level public officials made public statements commenting on criminal cases involving real or perceived opponents, either prior to or soon after their detention. In addition, most judges and prosecutors in the past years have been appointed provisionally and outside of the procedures established in the Constitution, rendering them vulnerable to undue interference in the way they carry out their functions and the decisions they make, and also subject to disciplinary and dismissal procedures which are not in line with constitutional guarantees. Moreover, according to sources from within these justice sector institutions, the appointment of judges and prosecutors over the past years has been increasingly influenced by political and personal considerations. Former judges and prosecutors interviewed reported that they and their family members had been subject to threat and intimidation. Nearly half of the former judges and prosecutors interviewed by the mission left Venezuela due to safety concerns. Our investigations equally reveal that the state is not taking tangible, concrete, and progressive steps to remedy violations, combat impunity, and provide redress to the victims through investigations and prosecutions. The state reported that in the period between 2014 and May 2021, in total, between 379 and 397 state officials were convicted for human rights violations. The limited availability of public information regarding prosecutions in these cases creates significant challenges in assessing the government's efforts to investigate and prosecute human rights violations. Nonetheless, in relation to the 19 cases included in the mission's 2020 report involving targeted repression against real or perceived opponents of the government, the mission reviewed the status of domestic investigations and proceedings, and in all but 3 of those cases, there was no information indicating any progress. In fact, 3 of the 5 cases presented this May by the chief prosecutor of Venezuela as emblematic cases in which there had been positive developments in the proceedings were also cases investigated by the mission, the cases of Fernando Alberto Alban, Rafaela Costa Arevalo, and Juan Pablo Pernalete. And the mission considers that the scope of investigations is either limited to less serious crimes, or only the lowest level perpetrators face criminal prosecution, or both. Several of those considered to be opponents of the government are detained and then held by intelligence agencies, the GINEBRA and SEBIN, at times for prolonged periods without charges, and sometimes in spite of judicial orders for their release. On 12th of May 2021, President Maduro adopted a decree ordering the transfer within 30 days of detainees in the GINEBRA and SEBIN custody to detention centers run by the Ministry of Penitentiary Services. However, according to the information available to the mission, 19 political prisoners remain in the GINEBRA facilities, and no transfers were made of detainees held by SEBIN after that date. These and other individuals perceived as opponents to the government are subjected to various and compounded violations, including arbitrary detention and torture, and also to due process irregularities, which we will now turn to.
We can unmute Mr. Cox, Vial. Go ahead. Thank you. Go ahead, Francisco.
Thank you. The mission has reasonable grounds to believe that frequent procedural irregularities are committed by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela's justice systems against real or perceived opponents. The mission's investigation of cases revealed that illegal detentions are a frequent occurrence, abusing the flagrante delito exception that allows an arrest without a judicial warrant. The mission also documented when arrest warrants were issued, discrepancies abounded in the case reviewed. Prosecutorial and judicial actors either played a direct role in these discrepancies, such as by backdating arrest warrants, or an indirect role by routinely including the inaccurate or deceptive arrest records in legal cases perpetrated during the arrest and detentions. Given the focus of the report, the mission paid particular attention to instances in which these allegations were raised with judicial authorities without effective response. In 113 of the 183 cases of detentions reviewed by the mission, detainees or their representatives have made allegations of torture, sexual violence, and or other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment perpetrated. In 67 of these, the detainees appeared in court with clear marks of mistreatments or raised allegations of torture, sexual violence, and or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment during court proceedings. Such allegations have also been raised by family members and legal representatives in written submissions to control courts, the public prosecutor's office, or the ombudsperson's office. In cases investigated, there is no indication of any action having been taken. The mission is also concerned that many of the detainees were handed back to the custody of agencies who allegedly had tortured them. Therefore, the mission calls upon judges to cease ordering pretrial detention in Sabina Licoide and Plaza Venezuela, and DGCIM's Boleita and Fuerte Tiuna, and ensure proper application of orders regarding the place of detention by law enforcement and intelligence bodies. The mission has also reasonable grounds to believe that prosecutors and judges played a key role in arbitrary arrests by sustaining arrest warrants, pretrial detention orders, and serious criminal charges based on facts and evidence that did not refer to criminal acts or individualize the defendant's participation in the crimes alleged. In some cases, prosecutors and judges sustained detention or charge based on evidence that was manipulated or fabricated, or even obtained under torture. This situation is seriously aggravated by the constant obstacles that judicial and prosecutorial actors put forward against defense lawyers to do their job. The mission reminds that the right to a legal defense is a cornerstone of due process. Some procedural irregularities previously mentioned amount to serious violations of due process of law, while others infringe on the personal integrity and liberty of defendants, among other human rights. Although the mission continues to investigate other human rights violations falling within its mandate, significant delays in recruitment staff members impeded its capacity to carry out in-depth investigation into violations outside the current area of focus to present to the Human Rights Council at its 48th session. For most of 1 year period between the 45th and 48th session, the mission operated with less than 1/3 of its intended capacity. The focus of the present report in no way minimizes cases involving extrajudicial killing, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, and torture, and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including sexual and gender violence committed against other individuals in Venezuela. The mission continues to investigate rigorously these other violations and analyze criminal structures and chains of command of individual and institutional actors in Venezuela, and will provide further analysis and conclusions at the Human Rights Council session in March and September of 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marta and Francisco. So I just should point out that the questions and answers segment should be in English only. Interviews and or comments in Spanish can be arranged afterwards or on request after this press conference by contacting Connor Fortune, whose contact details are at the bottom of the press release you will have received by now. So now we turn to you for your questions. We have a question from F.A. Antonio Broto. You can unmute Antonio. Go ahead, Antonio.
Hello, good afternoon. So, given the situation where the justice is part of the repressive system, I wonder if the mission recommends the renovation of institutions like Tribunal Supremo, if you point some special officers that should be removed from their posts, and also if you think that international justice should participate in the investigations and the trials of Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Okay, over to you, panelists. Who wants to take that first? You can just unmute yourself when, okay, Marta, please.
Thank you. I'll take the first question and Francisco can take the second. Thank you for your question. In our detailed findings, the report, which is almost 200 pages, we have formulated several recommendations, particularly focusing on justice sector actors, including the Supreme Tribunal of Justice and others. These recommendations pertain, of course, to many of the issues and reforms that we believe are necessary on the basis of our investigations and analysis. We do not formulate any recommendations specifically on the removal of any concrete individuals. I would like to mention, however, that we do have a confidential document, an annex to the report, where we have included the names of all those justice sector actors that we have been able to identify as having had a role in the cases that we have documented in our reports. Thank you. Over to Francisco.
With regards to the role that international justice may play, as a fact-finding mission, we have our clear mandate, and international tribunals and universal jurisdiction by states must be triggered by their own procedures and with their own basis of information. Our report, of course, is one of those bases of information, the one of this year and the one of the previous year, but the decision as to when and where justice might be triggered at the international level must be with full respect of their proceedings, both by international justice, by international tribunals, but also by states that exercise or would like to exercise universal jurisdiction.
Thank you both. We now have a question from Gabriela Sotomayor from El Proceso, from Mexico. Gabriela, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Rolando. I have two questions, if may I. I have spoken with relatives of the imprisoned, tortured soldiers. They tell me that the military receive worse and more serious punishments than civilians. Many do not have sentences, and after the visit of the commission of the Office of the High Commissioner, Madame Bachelet, and the interviews they had with them, there were reprisals and torture intensified after. So what can you say about the military who are accused of conspiring against the government? If you can talk a little bit about this. And secondly, the mission, in your report, you say that the mission found reasonable grounds to believe that high-level Venezuelan political actors have exercised significant influence over the justice system. So can you name some of these politicians? Could President Maduro himself be involved? Thank you very much.
Over to you for your responses, colleagues.
I'd suggest that Francisco would take the first and I'll take the second, if that is okay.
Okay. We have documented both in this report and the former report that military are subject to the violations and both torture and other situations. So yes, I mean, that is a fact. As to what happened after the visit of mission of the High Commissioner, we haven't documented that, and we have made it a statement or a ground for any statement that we make that we fully investigate before giving an opinion. So we can't comment on that aspect. But if you review the report, among those that are considered as opponents, real or perceived by the government as opponents, there are militaries, and there is mentioning of the use by the military prosecutors of evidence obtained under torture or allegations of torture and fabricated evidence. So military suffer the consequences that we are documenting in this report as violations of due process to their physical integrity and their liberty.
Thank you also for your first, or rather second question. Yes, indeed, as I mentioned during my remarks, in fact, in 102 out of 183 cases that we have examined, we have recorded statements made by several high-level public officials which were related to the criminal cases, sometimes going as far as commenting on the criminal responsibility or culpability of the individual at a moment when the individual was just about to be detained or just after the detention. And we do consider that this type of statements are a form of interference with the independence of the justice system and should be avoided. As you will see in our detailed findings, there are several public officials who we have recorded having done that, and at least in one case that is the President of the Republic, but not only. You will find all the details of other cases also in the detailed findings. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now we'll turn to Lisa Schlein from Voice of America for a question. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Rolando, and then to the panel. Hello. I'd like to ask you about the conditions of confinement. I mean, people are being tortured and sexually abused, so it's pretty horrific. But if you could discuss a bit more in regard to whether they are given any kind of services that they need, medical care, if they get enough to eat, deprived of food, whether the prisons themselves are overcrowded and people are getting sick and dying from COVID. Are they, do they have access to lawyers? I get a sense not. Family visits. And then the government doesn't like you, doesn't talk to you, but have you sent your report to the government? Have you received any response? If so, what, please? Thank you.
Please go ahead, Marta.
Thank you. I'd again suggest that Francisco takes the first and I'll take the second, if that's okay.
As to the conditions of confinement, as we documented last year and we still mention in this report, the conditions, of course, are in violation of the detainees' human rights violations. There is overcrowding. There is still, we have documented cases of torture, and the effect on family members, especially female family members, where there is abuse in or even excessive searches when they go into prisons. So that could be, considered as inhumane treatment. And so the conditions are very bad, overcrowded. And as you say, and we mentioned in the report, one of the concerns and one of the violations that we have documented with reasonable grounds to believe, that is the standard that we use, there is obstacles to access, for lawyers to access their clients and the persons that they represent. And this, of course, added with the procedural irregularities, where there is delay in presenting the person that is detained before a judge. And even when they are presented and they claim, as we have said, they have suffered torture, judges are not taking action. They're not complying with their legal duty to take actions, to ask for investigations by the proper authorities, among others. And as we say, many times they are handed back to the agencies that allegedly have tortured them. So, of course, the conditions are still very bad and in infringement of their human rights.
Thank you. With regards to your second question, whether we have sent the report to the government for comments, we have tried to contact both government authorities and other authorities, such as the chief of the Supreme Tribunal of Justice and also the chief prosecutor of Venezuela. In all of our letters, or to all of our letters, we received no response at all, which is something that we deeply regret. In one of those letters, we have also offered the government to send our report for comments, and once again, we received no response. I'd also like to add that in addition to that letter, we have also sent letters specifically to Chief Justice of the Supreme Tribunal of Justice and Chief Prosecutor, asking them whether they could send us their remarks or additional information regarding allegations that are contained in our report, specifically in relation to them. And unfortunately, we have not received any response from them either.
Thanks for your responses. We now have a question from Laurent Sierro of Swiss News Agency. Over to Laurent.
Yeah, thank you, Rolando. Thank you for taking my question. The first one is a follow-up question on something you said at the Council in March, because you said you wanted to investigate further potential extrajudiciary killings in January by the FARC. So I wanted to know whether you reached a conclusion on that. And then secondly, is there a particular approach by the judges, depending on who's making the arrest, for instance, FARC, because there have been numerous calls to dismantle this unit. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Over to you, panelists.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I'll take the first, and Francisco could take the second. Your first question relating to extrajudicial executions committed by the FARC, which are part of the Bolivarian National Police. We have documented those cases in our first report published in September of last year. We have mentioned indeed in our March oral update, as well as now in our report, as you will see, that we remain concerned with continued allegations of this type of violations, specifically extrajudicial executions. As we also explain in our report, we have opted for this particular report to focus on the responses of the Venezuelan justice system to cases of opponents or perceived opponents to the government. So we have not done detailed investigations and analysis of extrajudicial executions to the point that we were ready to publish on those violations at the moment. We will, in the coming months, continue investigating these and other violations under our mandate, and we do plan to report about those in the coming year, both in March and September. And I hope that you'll be reading our findings then. Thank you.
Francisco, did you have something to add? No, not this. Okay. Go ahead. You're unmuted. Está bien? No, it's okay. Could you unmute Francisco?
Thank you. Now I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, with regards to the approach of judges in regards to FAES proceedings, actually, as Marta has said, and because of the problem that we had in terms of staffing and the delays in the staffing of our members, and we only were able to focus on the judicial approach of real or perceived opponents. So the proceedings of FAES really weren't part of the focus of this report. But as Marta says, we hope that the process of recruitment is fast, and so we can actually focus on all these areas, and we will focus and give an update in March and September 2022. Thank you.
Thanks for those explanations. We have a question now from Nick Cumming-Bruce of the New York Times. Nick, go ahead, Nick.
Thank you very much. Two questions, actually. First, this is your second report. I'm wondering to what extent you have seen anything that would suggest the government is responding to the issues that you raise and the recommendations that you make. I mean, your first report came out at a time when there was some engagement with the Human Rights Council. I'm wondering if we should see that there's any good faith attempt to respond to any of the recommendations, or whether this engagement was essentially cosmetic. And the second issue, you're not the only UN panel that has suffered from financial constraints, but I wonder if you could just give an indication of to what extent financial pressures have limited your inquiries. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the first question, and Francisco can take the second. Just wanted to confirm if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay.
We're all good.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Nick. Yes, this is our first report, and unfortunately, as I've mentioned in my remarks, some of the violations and crimes that we have documented last year continued over this past year. And that is why we have included, we've documented cases that have taken place in the last months, over the last year. In terms of the responses, which is really the primary focus of our report, the responses of the justice system to those violations. Well, as I've also noted, we've heard the states reporting about prosecutions and convictions for human rights violations. But as I've also noted, the fact that the publicly available information about what these prosecutions and convictions were for. So we're talking about what type of charges, what level in the chain of command were those accused and convicted. This makes it really hard to assess properly the government's response to these violations, or rather the justice system response to these violations. What we were able to do is, in the cases that we have investigated last year in depth, and the ones that we've investigated this year, through not only our interviews with the persons involved, but as I mentioned, through extensive review of case files, which is, you could say, probably the most objective type of information that you can analyze. We have identified, as I've mentioned, that out of those 19 cases we had documented in our first report, that in all but 3 cases, there had been no progress, at least not in the information that is publicly available and through the persons that we've been able to interview. And even in 2 of those 3 cases that I just mentioned, as I've also noted, these were cases presented as emblematic, as having, as being representative of progress and positive steps in the way that the justice system is dealing with these violations. But in fact, our assessment is that even in those cases, the scope of the charges is very limited and limited to the less serious crimes, and also focused on the low-level perpetrators, which is something that we've identified also as a problem if the state really wants to provide full accountability and contribute to prevention of these crimes in the future.
Yes, thank you. With regards to the second question, and thank you for the question, the short answer is absolutely, yes. We, due to the low numbers of staff members that we were able to recruit at this stage, we had to refocus in many opportunities the focus of the report. And it's a shame because we are created to fulfill a mandate that we owe to the Human Rights Council, but also to the victims of the human rights violation that we have documented. And a lot of the information that we were gathering would have made it possible to have a broader report, and we had to focus on this. We think this is a crucial aspect of the human rights crisis that Venezuela is living. The justice system should be a safeguard for victims and should be the last resort of protection of victims. And as we report, this is not the case in Venezuela. So it is an important report, but had we a full staff, we could have focused on other issues that are critical for the people that are suffering the human rights violations in Venezuela. So thank you for the question.
Thank you both. We now have another question from Antonio of FA. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rolando. So I want to know more about the judges that have left Venezuela for the intimidation they suffer. For that, I would like to know how many you know with this situation, because you say that it's half of the ones you interview, but I don't know how many you interview. And second, I would like to know which kind of intimidation they told you that they suffered. It was death threats, public criticization, maybe in the media or from the president, or other kind of pressure that they told you they suffered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. Over to you, colleagues. I think, Marta, we need to unmute you. Okay, go ahead, please.
Sorry about that. Thank you for your question, Antonio. And, saying that it is half of the judges and prosecutors that we have interviewed gives you think, a good idea of the prevalence of these type of threats and intimidation. But even if I would give you the number exactly of the persons that we have directly spoken with, what this tells you is that it is prevalent, meaning that if we would have spoken with double the number that we've spoken with, likely you would find more people in that situation. And so what I think is important to take from here is that fact, the fact that not only is it not just one or two isolated cases, but that it is happening and it is having a very important impact on people's lives. So here we're talking about members of the judiciary and prosecutors who, because of not being seen as aligned with a certain perception of what the justice system should be doing, are forced to leave their country and live in fear, even abroad. I also want to mention that actually we have contacted also, we've reached out to even other prosecutors and judges that still live in Venezuela who declined to speak with us precisely because of their fear of reprisals. And so this is something that is very serious. Not only in terms of the impacts that are caused in their lives and their professional lives, personal and professional lives, but also in the messages that are sent to other judges and other prosecutors, which is to be aligned or else be quiet. And so in terms of the judges that we have interviewed, I can tell you that 6 of those that we have interviewed left the country. But as I mentioned before, what to take from here is really the effect that these type of intimidations have in their lives and in the system overall. Thank you.
Okay, Francisco, no, nothing to add. Okay, at this point, maybe just one final question from Gabriela, again, from El Proceso. Actually, we have Nick afterwards, so if we can indulge you panelists for a few more minutes. Yep, thank you. Gabriela, please. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. I have can it be said that the entire judicial system in Venezuela is compromised? Can we say that? And well, I was going to ask about the personnel and the lack of personnel and that you can't do your work. So that is really worrying, not only for human rights in Venezuela, but all over. And please do not forget to make a video statement in Spanish so we can send it to our media. Please, that's a little request. Thank you so much.
Who wants to take the question of compromise?
I think I'll take the first, and then Francisco, if you want to take the second, or if you'll let me know. So in terms of whether the whole justice system is compromised, I'd like to point out 2 things. We are clear in our report, and I've also mentioned it in my remarks, that our investigations and analysis is focused on responses of the justice system, in particular in cases against real or perceived government opponents. So as you will see in our detailed findings, we document several cases of persons who fit in this profile. And therefore, the findings in relation to procedural irregularities and the actions and the missions of actors within the justice system are related to specifically to those cases, to cases of persons with this type of profile. Now, a lot of the considerations that we make in relation to the causes of interference and compromise of judges and prosecutors' independence, which, as I mentioned, come from both external actors, including political actors, and from within the judicial and prosecutorial hierarchies. These are issues that affect the whole justice system, or a lot of them, including, as I mentioned to you, the fact that most judges and prosecutors in the past years, or rather judges and prosecutors in the past year, have been appointed provisionally, which compromises their independence for the reasons that I mentioned. All of this is, of course, more systemic, but the findings regarding the specific actions or omissions in the cases did pertain to cases specifically against perceived opponents of the government. We do, as we mentioned, we will continue reporting about violations committed against other individuals in Venezuela, which we are keeping abreast of, but we want to investigate and analyze more in depth. And of course, then we will also be able to report, as we've done in our first report, on the responses of the justice system to those particular cases as well. Thank you.
And just briefly, I think just to complement a little bit of what Marta says, and we have also in our detailed report, you'll see that one statement that is a matter of concern was made by the chief prosecutor, saying that that the positions of prosecutors were charges of trust, cargos de confianza. Sorry for the Spanish, but just to make clear that that clearly infringes on the independence of prosecutors. Also, when the current chief prosecutor takes hold, former prosecutors stated that some of the offices were raided by armed security forces. So that's the kind of intimidation that some of them felt, and that's why prosecutors and judges have left. As to the financial crisis and other decisions taken that have undermined our capacity to fulfill our full mandate, we completely agree that it's a shame, and that we hope that this is remedied quickly. Thank you.
Thank you both. Nick, the final question.
Yeah, thank you very much. A quick question. You talk about the interference in the work of judges and prosecutors from high-level political actors. Well, you say political actors. My question is, how high level, how high did it go? Are we talking about the president himself, people in his office, people in his cabinet? Perhaps you could just give us some detail on that, please.
Thanks, Nick, for your question. Yes, well, as I've mentioned, I mean, we've documented different ways in which this interference is actually, or in ways in which the interference materializes, right? And so one of the ways I've mentioned already, which are statements by public officials, and these are public statements, so anyone can actually see them, and as I've mentioned, we document them in our report. There are other ways in which that interference is expressed and materializes, and in some cases it involves the passing of messages through Supreme Tribunal of Justice hierarchy and trickling down to presidents of criminal judicial circuits. And what we have heard from the members of the judiciary and prosecutors that we have interviewed and from whom we've received responses to our questionnaire is that these type of messages, well, sometimes you'll know who exactly from whom they originated, meaning outside of the hierarchies. In other cases, the direct judges that are working on the cases, or that were working on the cases, would receive those messages from their own hierarchy, as I mentioned. So, but with the reference to this coming from not only above, but from political actors, as I mentioned. So it depends. In some cases, you'll see references, direct references in our reports to who made a certain statement, for example. In other cases, what you'll find is the responses and the information that we receive directly from those who received the instructions, and this would have passed through different stages, and so they would only be able to identify the persons who more directly, meaning their superiors, had passed on the message to them.
Okay, I think that takes us to the end of the press conference. I'd like to thank you very, very much to our panelists for joining us. Muchísimas gracias. To Marta, Francisco, and Patricia, bienvenida. Quisiera recordar una vez más, podemos organizar entrevistas en español para ustedes. Debería ponerse en contacto con Connor Fortune. Sus datos se encuentran abajo del comunicado de prensa. So I'd like to also remind you that the fact-finding missions report will be presented to the Human Rights Council next week on Friday, 24 September. So once again, thank you very much for joining us and have a good afternoon. Thank you.